Hey everybody, this is Paul. Real quick before we get into the podcast, I just want to let you know that I have launched a new newsletter called Local News Industry Pulse, and it is a briefing of news, policy, trends, and more in the local news industry straight to your inbox every Thursday morning. So if you're enjoying the content I'm putting out with the podcast, I think you would also get a lot of value from the newsletter. So if you have a minute, go subscribe really quick to Local News Industry Pulse. You can scroll down in your podcast app and click on the link at the very bottom of the show notes right now, or go to localnewsindustrypulse.beehiiv.com. That's localnewsindustrypulse.beehiiv.com/subscribe, and you can sign up there and stay informed on everything that's going on in the local news industry every Thursday. All right, thanks. Let's get into today's episode.
But burnout is so common. I feel like when you're going and going and going and chasing stories, honestly, for me, I always have like 6 or 7 stories up in the air at one time. And I'm just juggling them and trying to, did this person send me pictures? Did I get a quote from that person? Is this, and running around, and it happens.
This is Small Press, Big Ideas, a podcast about the business of local news in the United States. I'm your host, Paul Gordon. Small Press Big Ideas is about the opportunities and challenges that local news publishers are facing for their businesses. I'll sit down and talk with journalists, entrepreneurs, nonprofit leaders, and more in the local news industry to find out what's working, what isn't, and how the local news ecosystem can innovate and flourish in the 21st century. Okay, today on the podcast, I am joined by Mega Roche. Megan is a senior multimedia journalist for local daily media in Virginia. She and I connected on LinkedIn, hopped on a call, and had some interesting stuff to talk about. So decided to have her on the podcast and talk about it here as well. So thank you, Megan, for joining me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, no problem. So you and I already talked, but for the audience, could you just give us a quick kind of like bio on your life and career? What kind of led you to local journalism, whatever you want to classify it as?
Sure. So I am Megan Roche. I was born and raised in Jersey. I started my journalism career in New Jersey with a group of kind of local newspapers and kind of branched off from there. I freelanced for a number of years and then finally got my first full-time journalism position as an editor for a group of community newspapers and magazines based in the Morris County and Essex County, New Jersey areas. Did that for about 5 years, but found that I was really missing the actual creative and writing and portion of that. So I jumped over to Virginia. My family and I moved here about 2 months prior to the COVID pandemic and found a local journalism organization. It's a daily publication, so every day we're putting out fresh content, which can be a grind. For those who know, working for a daily is very hard, but have been there for just about a year and a half and couldn't imagine doing anything else.
That's awesome. It's funny you moved right before the pandemic. My wife and I relocated from the Denver area to where we are in Western Colorado in late December 2019. So it's kind of in the same boat. I always tell people like, where you live changed since before the pandemic and after? I'm like, I don't know. I kind of moved here at a weird time. That's interesting. So were you kind of always interested in getting into journalism, or not local journalism in particular, but how far back does that interest go for you?
When I was in college for my bachelor's, I was kind of unsure what I wanted to do. So prior to that, in high school, I took 4 years of German as a foreign language requirement. And I was pretty much convinced that I was going to become a German high school foreign language teacher. And then I took one education class and said, yeah, no, this is not for me. And so changed my major. And of course, when I changed my major, that particular school didn't actually have a journalism program. So I ended up going and transferring to a small school in coastal Connecticut, Mitchell College, back in the summer of 2010, and went to Mitchell kind of thinking not really sure, maybe journalism. Took a intro to communications class, literally never looked back. Loved it. Got involved with the on-campus radio station, Radio Mitchell. Radio Mitchell was a great time. I had my own talk show, and I started the Radio Mitchell news department where we did kind of your like 5 o'clock evening news broadcast and kind of talked about different things that were either going on campus or some larger world events. I know I want to say it was my senior year, being in coastal Connecticut in New England. We covered the Boston Marathon bombing, which was just about 2.5 hours away from our school. So we had, classmates who were from the Boston area, come on and talk to us about what this meant for them back home. And that was a really eye-opening experience. And that was probably kind of when I realized, like, okay, this is definitely something I want to do. And gratefully so, because it was my senior year and like 3 months before graduation. So
that's great. I always like to kind of just know where people are coming from, like how they kind of got into the line of work and everything. So you've been in the, around a decade or so, kind of in the local news ecosystem, which, kind of one of the reasons I got interested in this whole space and started the podcast is you always hear how local news is dead and it's collapsing and all this stuff. And it, in some ways it has over the past, 25 years, whatever you want to call it. And it was certainly already kind of happening, I'm assuming, when you came into it, but a lot has happened in the time you've been in the industry. Could you talk a little bit about just the difference in maybe your day-to-day working in like these kind of local newsrooms over the past decade or so as the whole industry has changed? And then also just what has changed with the companies you work with and freelance for over that time? Broad strokes, specific things, whatever you want to talk about.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and when I just kind of touched on it, is a lot of places are going so much toward freelance and contract-based work. I know at the newsroom I'm in currently at WI Daily, it's a team of 3 writers and 1 editor, and we cover 3 counties. So we cover Williamsburg, the city of Williamsburg, James City County, and York County. And those are some pretty big areas, and there's always a lot going on between just your school board, your board of supervisors, which is kind of our version of like mayor and council kind of thing. So those meetings, and then on top of that, just your everyday features and sports, and how everything kind of works together. Williamsburg, if anybody watching this is not familiar, Williamsburg is a extremely big like tourist destination here on the East Coast. This is kind of where the start of America actually happened back in the 1600s. So we have a place called Colonial Williamsburg, which is a gorgeous, like fully renovated, restored colonial district where they have, your costume players and they do reenactments, and we have a whole fife and drum corps. So there's always so much going on with just that alone. And then we also have Yorktown, which is a Revolutionary War site. It's actually where the Revolutionary War ended. And then we also have Jamestown, which is where the English first landed when they came to America in 1607. So there's a lot of history here, which is great because it's great for those kind of in-depth feature articles. But at the same time, we're in the middle of summer. It's busy. There's a lot of traffic. There's a lot of things going on. There's festivals, street festivals, free concerts, little things like that going on in the community. So for a newsroom of 3 plus an editor, it can be really, really, really hard to get to everything. And I know just on my own personal, my personality, I never want to see a story not get covered. So I'm always like running to, here, there, and everywhere and trying to make sure we get to everybody. And that can be really, really hard.
And how would that have looked different? I mean, I don't think you were the same organization 10 years ago, say, like earlier in your career. Would you have had more support? And are you guys also leaning on some freelance talent? What does that look like?
We don't have any freelancers.
Okay.
We have kind of unique relationships with a couple different more regional things. Like we have a really great relationship with the Virginia Mercury, which they publish more regional stuff, and we're allowed to kind of pull from them for regional content, which is nice. And then, we also have our company has a sister radio station. So we're able to kind of, do some interviews with some people that are on our radio side, and they come over to the newsroom side and do that. But as far as when I started, I don't know. I think it's pretty much stayed the same, if not gotten a little bit worse, where there's such an uptick in events that want coverage and such a downfall of how many reporters are actually on the staff and able to do things. I would love to see that change. Because again, I never want to see a story go to waste. I never want to see a story go to the wayside. I think every story is important. I mean, by default, I'm kind of our WI Daily sports reporter. So anything with sports, I never ever want to see fall to the wayside. But sometimes it has to happen just given the fact that you don't have the resources.
Yeah, yeah, that I've heard that quite a bit. Just talking to people and like doing this podcast. It's funny, because I've kind of come to the thing kind of from the business side, and it's like that's what I always hear, and all the data shows me is that the need and the want for local coverage is there, but like sometimes the existing models, just like business models, really just don't work, and it's kind of like kind of the purpose of this podcast. I want to try and maybe uncover like there's got to be a way to make this work for everybody. You know what I mean? I'm pretty dug in on my position that I don't know that the old way is ever going to work again, you know, or everybody leaned on classifieds in a print edition of a paper or whatever. I mean, that kind of seems like a foregone time, but sorry, that's kind of a sidebar, but
No,
you just kind of,
I completely get it. I mean, we are 100% digital, which I think is great because we can get things out in a more timely manner. And it's not, we're waiting for the next edition to come out. I've worked for everything from weeklies, monthlies, quarterlies. This is my first daily job. And this is probably, while it is so busy and so go, 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 it's probably the one I've enjoyed the most because of the fact that every day is different. And I'm not, looking at a press release going, well, will we be in print by the time this event happens? Is it relevant? Everything that comes our way is kind of like, if we have somebody available, we'll go.
that's awesome. Yeah, I can see that being really appealing. Just the whole not doing the same thing every day, different locations. It's not boring. It doesn't sound like so. So you talked about how you're kind of the impromptu kind of sports reporter for the publication, and you and I talked about your Path to Paris series. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Can you kind of explain what it is, the way you kind of described it to me? And just kind of get into how you're telling a more like global, larger story through that local lens, because I think it's really cool. So if you just talk about that a bit.
Yes. Path to Paris kind of came about. Anybody who knows me knows that my favorite time of year is every 4 years with the Olympic Games. I will be unavailable for the next 2 weeks after Friday because I'll watch archery, I'll watch water polo. I don't care. I'm just fascinated by the Olympic Games. And so I was doing some research and, had it in my head, okay, 2024, we have Paris Olympics. How can we cover it? And I went to my boss and I was like, what do we want to do? And he's like, well, we need to find a way to make it local. And so I got this email actually from one of our readers who had said that there was a girl at the local college here, the College of William and Mary, who had been a rower. She'd graduated, but she was nominated to Team USA as an alternate for the rowing team. And I said, oh, okay, well, there's, a local tie. So I spoke to her and I said, I don't want to hold this until, the opening ceremonies or Olympic time. So I came up with this idea of Path to Paris to kind of feature our local ties to the Olympic Games, even though it's an international competition, how we have so many athletes from here and really get everybody excited about the Olympic Games. And for me, it was just a passion thing because I love watching that. So what's more fun than writing about something that you yourself are so into?
That's so cool because it's like, local coverage is really important in a lot of ways, literally to uncover corruption and stuff like that on a local level. But there's also one of the more positive things about it. I mean, that's positive too, but one of the funner things about it is just how it can really unite a community and stuff. And I could just see like if there was something like that in my neighborhood and I'm like, oh, that kid from the next town over is like an archer. That's so cool. You really get behind them and like be invested in it and everything. So it's really cool. What kind of feedback have you gotten from that? Have you heard anything from the community?
People have really liked it. So I think with local news, it kind of comes with the ebb and flow. Like some articles do better than others. Sophia, who is the rower, her article did very well. And then the following week, I kind of pivoted because I was struggling with how to find local ties. And I spoke to two sports psychologists and did a whole series on mentally elite athletes have to go through to train their mind to compete at the Olympic level. So that was 2 weeks ago that went out. This past Friday was a very niche local story, but I found out that the 1980 Winter Olympic torch run actually kicked off here in Virginia, and carried the torch from here to Lake Placid to kick off the Winter Olympic Games in 1980. And I actually found a plaque that is underneath the bridge in the next town over that kind of commemorates that was where it started. So that was kind of cool, kind of niche, and got to talk to the torchbearer from Virginia from that games who got that opportunity to represent the state. And then this Friday is kind of the listicle rundown of all of our athletes that qualified, what sport they compete in, and a little bit of their history. And then, the schedules, the links to here's where their competition kicks off, here's where they'll be competing, and just really letting people know that, like, hey, just because the Olympics are in Paris, we still have our many local ties to the games.
That's awesome. What was the 1980 Lake Placid? Was that the Miracle on Ice? Do you know? It was that games, right? That series of games. That's so cool. That's a cool tie right there. So just out of curiosity, for the era you're in, how many, I think of the U.S. being such a huge country geographically and population wise. It's shocking that there's so many just from that area that are going to, be somehow in the Olympics or alternates or whatever. It's surprising to me. How many? What's the population you have there, and what's that ratio look like?
Williamsburg is bigger, but I think the state of Virginia as a whole. So I didn't just focus it on just our local people. I did more of a statewide thing, just because the Olympics are so niche that there was only going to be one or two from our area, and it was like, well, let's kind of highlight everybody. So in total in Virginia, there's 15 Olympians that are going. And I believe, if I can rattle this off, we have an equestrian team member. We have a couple swimmers, a field hockey player, BMX biker who's going. And we have some rowers and a fencer. So there's definitely a gamut of sport too. There's not just Virginia's really good at fencing. Everybody across the board is going for all different sports.
Today's episode is sponsored by localpod.co. LocalPod offers podcast production and consulting for local news organizations and only local news organizations. LocalPod creates weekly news podcasts based off of the top stories from your publication. You provide the script, we handle the rest. We narrate your news, edit it, produce it with a custom intro and outro with music, and distribute the podcast to all available podcast apps. Your listeners will see your branding and hear your content in their podcast feed, just like wherever you're listening to right now. Podcasts are one of the most engaging digital formats, which is why we can also help you monetize your podcast as well. We offer custom ad reads for your podcast, and we can also set up subscriptions so that you can monetize your audience directly. Have you thought of launching a podcast but want to control it in-house? We can help you with that too. LocalPod offers podcast coaching. We offer in-depth one-on-one coaching calls, along with the actionable steps you need to launch a successful revenue-generating podcast of your own. To find out more, visit localpod.co. That's localpod.co. Or just click on the link in the episode show notes in your podcast app. All right, back to the show. There's always sports I'm surprised that are even Olympic sports. I did not expect you to say BMX biking. I did not even know that was a competition anymore.
We have, I believe it's the 2024 games. Breakdancing will be making its...
Really? It's impressive. Breakdancers are impressive. It should be.
It will be an Olympic sport.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. That's funny. I'll have some fun stuff to watch this year. That's cool. Okay, I'll pivot this a little bit because you and I talked about this when we talked on the phone. Because I like to ask people when I just talk to them, when I meet new people, what's the biggest challenge you have in your job? And you also mentioned it earlier. You talked about burnout. So could you talk a little bit about that? Burnout, especially working at a daily, and how it affects journalists. Can you talk about any experiences you have and just key takeaways or advice you have for somebody struggling with that? major
Yeah.
thoughts on it.
Burnout is very common in this industry. Kind of similar to you. I always love talking to other people who are in my industry just to find out kind of their story. And I had lunch not too long ago with a former journalist who now works in corporate communication. And she said, it's not uncommon. It's not uncommon for journalists, especially daily journalists, to finally kind of hit that wall and just have to transition into some other realm of communication, whether it's, public relations, marketing, corporate communication, because it does happen so frequently. I think there's a couple things at play. I think one, the news cycle that we are currently in this country is, all it is, shootings, stabbings, what's going on with the presidential election and
Border
it's
wall. Yeah. Like whatever. Yeah.
it's just constant like
Yeah.
negativity that sometimes that can feed into your brain. And I actually noticed that with myself where I was working for a publication that was very much like, we want to know about the taxes, we want to know about this. And that's all great, right? It was such a negative thing constantly that when I transitioned from that job into my job as an editor, the publication that I went to, they were very much about, we have a newspaper, but we want to push out all the good things that people are doing and kind of stay away from that town council and politics. And I noticed a mindset shift immediately where I suddenly loved my job again. And I got to really talk to interesting people. One of the stories, and I'll never forget this, was one of the first stories I covered for them. I spoke to a 8-year-old boy, and he had on his own mind, he saved all of his allowance for the year and bought a Christmas present for every child in the pediatric cancer wing of the local hospital. Now, I know me, I was not thinking about that at 8. Like, where's my toy? Like, no. But it's stuff like that I love. But burnout is so common. Like, I mean, I feel like when you're going and going and going and chasing stories, honestly, for me, I always have like 6 or 7 stories up in the air at one time. And I'm just juggling them and trying to, did this person send me pictures? Did I get the quote from that person? Is this, and running around, and it happens. And I think for me, when I first started noticing that I was going through burnout, I had to find something outside of work to become my hobby. And so I'll get into a little bit of that. So I had always been interested in dance and watching dance. And, when I lived in Jersey, my favorite Christmas tradition was always going to see the Radio City Rockettes. So I became obsessed with that and watching it. And I said, well, I wonder if there's a dance school that teaches adults. So I found a local dance studio and started taking dance classes at 32 years old, which is wild. So you're never too old to start something new. And then I performed in the recital and I loved it and I had such a good time. And that was kind of like those 2 hours in classes were like my time to shut my phone off, not look at my email, not pay attention to what was going on, because you need that creative outlet that's not writing, or when you're in a creative field, not doing something that relates to what you do for a job.
That's you went about that. That's really impressive on your part, because you went about that in a very healthy way. Because I think a lot of people, the trope with like writers is that they're like a bunch of drunks or whatever, like from a long time ago. You think Ernest Hemingway or whatever. But I think a lot of people turn to not necessarily just alcohol, but food, binge watching TV. You can do a lot of other stuff to distract yourself. So that's really impressive that you went out, got like moving, learned a new skill. That's really cool. That's awesome. You can have a lot of fun watching the breakdancing in the Olympics.
Yes, I'm a big gymnastics person, so I've always like geared toward, gymnastics, and that's usually what I go to for Summer Olympics. And then Winter Olympics, I'm usually geared toward the figure skating and the pairs skating and ice dance and all that. So I guess the thing just kind of runs throughout.
I'm a lifelong Colorado resident, so I'm always watching the skiing, snowboarding, and stuff like that, the winter ones. And I also wanted to comment on just what you were saying about the burnout with the negative news cycle. I haven't really talked about this like publicly on the podcast or anything, but one of the reasons I fell down the local news rabbit hole is I was so sick of the national news cycle, the mainstream media. I don't know what you want to call it, the big national, like you said, news cycle. Like, and I don't look at it anymore. Like, obviously the big stories come through, you hear when there's an attempted assassination or something like that. But I'm like, and then I'm like, what? Most of this is not important in my daily life. And then, I moved to this smaller town and it was hard for me to find information. I'm like, and that's kind of how this whole thing started. And I'm like, well, that's way more important. Like what's going on in your community and all that. And then, and then couple that with just the industry struggling and everything. So that's just my comment on that. So I 100% agree with you on that.
Well, I don't watch the news. I'm in the news. I don't consume the news.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm not a journalist. Like, I work with journalists and like news organizations and stuff, but I've never claimed to be like an actual journalist. So I can just imagine when you were saying how it just would get into your kind of skin, like reading it, it reminds me, have you ever played Tetris? You ever played too much Tetris? And then when you're trying to go to sleep at night and you're just like seeing the things moving around, like when your eyes are closed.
I'm guilty with that with Candy Crush Saga.
Yeah. I've got it on my phone right now.
Sleeping.
you do it too much, so it just works its way into your consciousness. And that's kind of what I think, just working in a day in and day out like that must do. And it's all, yeah. Anyway, I'll get off of that. So you talked about burnout. And it's kind of what you did to remedy that for yourself. But what advice would you give to your younger self when you started out in the industry that you know now? If you knew then what you know now, what would you tell yourself?
Oh man, it's
a big question. It's a big question. We can break it up into parts if you want. Go with the first thing that comes up. Yeah.
I think one thing, so when I was getting my bachelor's degree, I had this the one thing I wanted to do was I want to be a red carpet movie premiere reporter. I'm going to interview all the top celebrities. And the one thing I've learned about that more than anything is this is not a glamorous field. Everyone's like, oh, you get to stand on the sidelines and cover college football. Oh my God. It's a grind. It's a lot. I'm walking back and forth, taking pictures from end zones. And, it's not, I don't go to these events to enjoy them. I'm there to work. Then that's such a common misconception is people are like, oh, wow, you get all this excellent opportunities. And yes, it's fun. Don't get me wrong. I love going in and seeing college football and getting to stand right near the action. That's great. But in my mind, I'm always like, get that picture, get that quote, get that coach, get that player, it's not game's over. Let me go home and okay, I'll watch the highlights tomorrow. No, it's a daily grind for sure. And I think the other thing too is you have to know, especially with me working from home, I had to really come to understand that I needed to set healthy boundaries when it comes to work. Just because I'm home and I'm happen to be on my computer does not mean that at 11 p.m. I need to be checking emails and responding to people. I am entitled to have a life outside of work at the same time. And I need, I can't be all work all the time. Go out with friends, go get that, late night pizza and laugh with your friends, go hang out at the local bar with, your coworkers and watch the game and enjoy it, because it shouldn't be all about work. And I hate saying that because I genuinely love what I do, but there also comes a point where you have to put your own mental sanity first. And I think I really had to learn that, especially working for a daily, because you can't be on all the time.
Yeah, I think it's a symptom of our culture, the just kind of overworking and everything like that. I think France, somebody fact check me on this. I think a year or two ago, France passed a law where you literally cannot email an employee after 7 p.m. or something like that, unless it's like, they're a nuclear physicist at like the energy plant or something like that. Like, I mean, good luck getting that passed in the U.S., especially in the journalism industry or something. But I think it does speak a little bit just more broadly to our culture, that also. And then also what you said about how it seems so glamorous to being on the sidelines at a football game or whatever. So once again, I'm never a journalist, but I worked for about a decade at a beer distributor in Denver. And you'll see where I'm going with this. We might have talked about it on the phone. I don't remember. But I worked for the concessions and special events team. We set up all the big events and everything. So I don't know how many backstage concerts I've been to at Red Rocks Amphitheater, or like on the sidelines in the tunnels at the Broncos game or the Rockies game or whatever. And everybody's like, that's so cool. Can you get me a job there? I'm like, yeah, you're like spilling like rotten beer on yourself and stuff and trying to shuffle around and like putting out fires constantly. It's just like, it's the same kind of thing. it seems really cool, and then you're like, oh no, I'm here to work. I see.
Yeah.
I see what this is. Like, I can relate to you on that one.
And I think the other thing too is, and this is just kind of on the work from home culture. I remember very much during the start of kind of the COVID shutdown and everybody kind of transitioning into the work from home life. All of my friends that had never worked from home before, they're like, Megan, how do you do this?
It's hard.
Yeah. And I'm like, I don't know. I'm just used to it because their misconception prior to COVID was like, you work from home? Or do you watch Netflix all day? No, no. Like emphasis on the work here, but people don't sometimes I think understand that work from home culture is like, no, I don't just sit around. Like, yes, do I throw a load of laundry in before a meeting? Sure. Do I, throw dinner in the crock pot if I have 15 minutes? Yes. But I'm not, just lounging on the couch streaming Netflix all day long.
Yeah, no, and I work for myself. Like, I mean, I have clients and stuff, so it's really easy for me to be like, well, do I have to do that right now? And it's like, well, if I don't, might not have like money coming in, later on. It's a learned skill, doing stuff like that. So you talked about being the kind of how you thought it was going to be this glamorous thing, interviewing celebrities and stuff. And I believe you said something on our phone call around just that they're just people, like higher profile people or celebrities. I don't know the story of who you talked with. Could you speak on that for a minute and how you tell like younger people in the field just to send that email, make that go for that intro or whatever? Just speak about that for a minute.
Yeah. So one of my coworkers actually recently pointed this out to me. My coworker Stephanie Sabin, so I'll give her a little bit of a shout out here. But she said to me, I think. And she said, I think your problem, and it's not really a problem, but I think the issue is working for a local publication. What's sometimes hard is I see the world in such a larger frame mindset. And I think a lot of that stems from, I come from an area where, it was always our ABC affiliate was the one out of New York City. So we'd get, all the big time, interviews and stuff like that. And I had to really restructure to realize like, okay, how do I kind of going back to that Olympic thing? How do I find the local piece to a larger story? But one thing about me is I am not afraid to send that email because the worst thing anybody can say to you is, I'm sorry, it's just not the right timing, or they don't get back to you. And believe me, it's not easy to not get a response or to get a response like that. But I'd rather ask and be told no than never ask and always wonder what if. And I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten an email back and I'm like, really? They want to talk to me? That's so crazy. Like I didn't think, it was just a shot in the dark kind of thing. So I had that happen to me. This is kind of a crazy story. So I grew up in the early 2000s and I was a teenager in the early 2000s and I fell in love, much like every other person in the world at that time, with American Idol. Loved the show, loved everything about it. And I was really interested and became quite infatuated with learning everything I could about Paula Abdul because she was always the one and very sweet and very, all of the above. And I really kind of fell in love with a lot of her ideas that she presented and these thoughts that she had about, just being grateful for every opportunity and things like that. So I had the opportunity in 2018, a chronic pain magazine approached me and asked me if I would be interested in writing their cover story for their upcoming issue. And they said, we have this great person we want you to interview. I was like, oh, great. Okay. And it actually ended up being Paula Abdul.
Oh man, that's awesome.
She and I have had a relationship for a number of years. So it was one of those where I kind of had to be like, okay, you know everything about her. What are you gonna say? So I remember specifically getting on this phone call with her and, she's like, hi, how are you? I'm like, oh, I'm so good, Miss Abdul. Thank you so much for talking to me. And she's like, are you kidding me? I'm like, I don't want to not be professional. Like, I'm sorry. And it was awesome. And then, for me, that was such a crowning achievement, not only from I got to interview somebody I grew up, kind of idolizing. And at the same point, I got to write my very first cover story that ended up being distributed in like Barnes and Nobles and CVS's and things like that. And it was just such a like cool career moment where I got the opportunity to interview someone that I've always loved, but still kind of relate it to my career. And then actually during the pandemic, I wrote a book about her and I and the relationship that we have.
That's so cool. Yeah. I've worked with some not that famous, but somewhat famous people on some podcasts I've produced. They've been like guests on the show, and
Yeah.
I'm always struck by like almost every time, like, oh, they're cool. They're just like it's like talking to you. It's just like talking to somebody on the other end of the thing. It's a big kind of unlock. It makes it way less intimidating to send that email or whatever. You know what I mean?
I usually get off the phone with those interviews, and I'm like, damn, that was so cool.
Yeah, agreed. I think this episode is going to be great for anybody looking to get into the field, because you said when we spoke, like, we need good people. We need good, talented people to come into this field. And like you said, it's maybe not all glamorous and amazing, but that's a pretty cool story that, like, you met this kind of idol of yours. You had to make sure when you first met her to not give away that you knew, not sound like a stalker, right? Just be, hello, Mr. Abdul, how's your 12-pound Yorkie, Paulette? I mean, no, I didn't know it,
Well, so, and to kind of preface that, so I first got the opportunity to meet her when I was still in high school.
I see.
We formed this crazy relationship. So that's why when I got on the phone to interview her and I was like, yes, how are you? She was like, you don't talk like that. I know you better. Like,
I see. I had it backwards. I'm sorry. I see now.
I was always like, oh, and I just remember being like so nervous for that interview because I was like, oh my God, if you screw this up, like this is like your top tier interview that you've always wanted to get. And I treated it like a conversation, but I still have the audio file and I listened to it recently, and you can tell like the first 10 minutes of the interview, like my voice is like shaking and just, oh, that's so amazing. And I'm like, what's wrong with you? Like, why are you acting like it? But yeah, that was definitely a career highlight for sure. Getting to
That's
do
so
that.
cool. It's always so hard listening to yourself on audio. I've done a lot of it. It's easier, but it's never pleasant all the time. Okay, what else did I miss, Megan, that we didn't talk about? To anybody looking to get into the field, just general thoughts on the way the industry is playing out. But what did I not ask you or talk about that you may have thought of?
Well, I think, the biggest thing is in this industry, we need people who are go-getters, like I said earlier, who are not afraid to send that email, ask that question, get to the bottom of whatever. But also, I think to be a journalist, you really have to be one of these people that you have such a broad range of interests and you know a little bit about each one of them to make it work. And then you can uncover so many different stories. Like, doing these Olympic stories, like, I don't know anything about fencing. I was like, I know there's like weapons and I know that they wear like, all this protective gear. So I just kind of went with that and treated the interview like a conversation. And I walked away being like, oh, well, I learned something new today. There's all these different versions of being a fencer, but you have to have such an interest in so many different little things and know just enough to get yourself by, and you can breeze through any interview.
That's awesome. That's great. I'm gonna have to. This episode is, I think, going to be gold for anybody trying to get into this field because it's really cool. It's like you're not blowing smoke like this is a cakewalk or anything, but it's like it's getting me pumped up just hearing about it. It's really cool.
It's one of those industries. I think there's late nights, early mornings. I've worked my fair share of weekends, and I'm also, if I'm interviewing someone that's, a high profile person, they'll come back to me and say, I can do PM on Monday. I'm like, great, sounds good. I'll rearrange my schedule because you never know. That may be your only shot. So you better take it. And if you can rearrange your schedule and make it work, that's what I always do is just, I'm like, oh, okay, great. Sounds great. Yep. Got it in my schedule. And it's like, well, let me cancel that doctor's appointment. Let me move this around just because you never know if you're going to get another shot to talk to that person.
That's great. Awesome. Well, Megan, thank you for being on here. I think we've covered everything I had. Can you tell everybody listening where find you, anything else you'd like to share, anything you'd like me to link to in the show notes?
So I have a website. Paul, I will definitely send you the link to that. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm always open to talking to younger journalists or up-and-coming journalists. I've done a couple of talks at high schools to some newspaper staffs who are interested in maybe pursuing a career in journalism. Definitely don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm always open to having a conversation, kind of learning. And anytime anybody has a question, just drop me an email, shoot me a text. I'm open to it.
Awesome. We'll do that. We'll link to all your stuff, and put this on LinkedIn as my primary one and everything. So yeah, great. Thank you so much for joining me. I love talking again.
Absolutely.
Again. Awesome. All right. Thank you for listening to Small Press Big Ideas. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to help the show, the best thing you can do is to tell a friend or colleague and just take a few minutes to leave a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to right now. It only takes a minute out of your day, but it really does help the podcast grow and reach more ears. Check back for new episodes every Monday.